Okay, here's my continuation on ethical egoism, and particularly talking about the works of Ayn Rand. So, and again, I hope you've got a copy here. I think it might be a little easier if you've got a copy of the PowerPoint so that you can follow along. So, actually, her book, The Fountainhead, appears, and I've never read The Fountainhead. This appears, I think, shortly after World War II in the late 1940s, something like that. And generally, it's a book about an architect. Atlas Shrugged, which appears about 10 years later. First off, there's a very famous opening line, the very first line of the book, and I pass this along, this opening line. Who is John Galt? And you might see this as a piece of graffiti. Sometimes you see it as a bumper sticker or something like that. So if you ever see this question, who is John Galt? This person is an Ayn Rand fan. That's the opening question, and it reemerges periodically throughout Atlas Shrugged, and it takes us about 950 pages before John Galt emerges, and he finally gives us his philosophy. Summarizing an 1,100-plus page book is impossible, but I'll tell you briefly, and this is the best way I can summarize it, very briefly, is that in the book there are two different groups. You have the makers and the takers. And the makers are the industrious ones, the innovative ones, the hardworking ones, and the takers is everybody who kind of depends on the makers to provide them with a way of life. So people who don't work hard, people who expect, the government's going to take something from the makers and then in turn pass it along to those who have needs. And if you have a need, then you're entitled to claim what other people have produced. And John Galt is kind of the leader of the takers. Believe me, I'm not giving you much in the way of spoilers for an 1,100-page book. And so there's a bit of a revolution that the John Galt leads with the makers, and they withdraw from society. They quit. They leave. And suddenly, what is society without the best and the brightest and most hardworking people in it? It's nothing. And this is her point, is that people work for themselves. People always work for themselves. So if you look along, for instance, I'm looking at my slide number 8, and there's a couple of phrases here, particularly in slides 8 and 9, some quotes from Ayn Rand. And one of them on slide 8, my philosophy in essence is the concept of man as a heroic being, a man who can overcome his circumstances. And this is bolded with his own happiness as the moral purpose of his life. And then going on, the productive achievement is his noblest activity and reason as his own absolute. And so her philosophy technically is called objectivism. It's not a perfect match with egoism, but it's fairly close, and we'll take it for the moment. And the idea that she says that the purpose of man's life is his own happiness, that's the moral purpose of his life. That's good enough for us for right now. I've also included some other Ayn Rand quotes, which I'll leave you to kind of read. I would point out the second one of 4. I swear by my life and my love of it that I will never live for the sake of another man, nor ask another man to live for mine. And actually, this is a John Galt quote from Atlas Shrugged. And I also see this quote periodically just in various sources. And it, is actually a pretty powerful way of summarizing what her basic philosophy is. I live for myself, and I will sacrifice for no one. And I expect that everyone else will do the same. Some of the tenets of objectivism, and there are 4 kind of, if you will, pillars, tenets, key ideas. And I'm not entirely satisfied with the way Donna Wood has presented these. But let me comment on them briefly, because I think it's worthwhile as an extension. So, for instance, objective reality. Ayn Rand is very much believed in reality as we perceive it, as we can deal with it rationally. She did not believe in higher powers. She's an unapologetic atheist. And therefore creates, politically at least, some kind of interesting tension. Obviously, start thinking about individual self-interest and minimal, extremely minimal government. This seems to be naturally aligned with some right-wing or certainly more Republican politicians, but their base is also very much a very central part of the Republican or right-wing base is also the social conservatives and evangelical Christians, and so they clearly don't accept this, and they don't accept. There's a lot of people over in the Republican Party and the right-wing factions in the United States who really reject Ayn Rand principally because she just didn't believe in God. That's all there is to it. But she believed that as man saw and perceived things and dealt with facts and information rationally, that's what would lead us to a better world. Reason is man's greatest asset. It's what sets us aside from other animals. It's what distinguishes human beings from anyone else. Is our ability to reason, to solve problems, to see relationships among complex things. The individual ethics, the individual is the most important, if you will, point of reference in any civilized society, and individual rights. And if you go backwards to one of my quotes, the smallest minority on earth is the individual. That's the unit of primary unit of analysis, not the group, not the community, not the society, but the individual is the primary focus for objectivism. And finally, and if you have the opportunity, I would strongly encourage you to check out Ayn Rand's interview with Mike Wallace. It was recorded in 1959. It's black and white. It's not high def, but this was, it's broadcast live in the United States back then. And I want you to keep in mind, we only had 3 networks in the late 1950s. And sometimes they actually devoted prime time. Everybody was watching TV, and sometimes they would devote prime viewing time to these kinds of discussions and that sort of thing. So Mike Wallace, and particularly, I think, there's a 30-minute interview, and they break it up on YouTube, and it's particularly, I believe, part 2 of Mike Wallace's interview with Ayn Rand is worth checking out. And he asks her questions about economics, and at some point she comes up with a very I guess we'll go ahead and call it a powerful phrase, or at least an important phrase for her, which is, I believe just like we have the separation of church and state, I believe in the separation of state and economics. We should keep the state, the government, out of economic transactions. Economic transactions should be freely chosen and should be based on free will, and there should be no coercion. You shouldn't be coerced to buying a car with an airbag, and no auto company should be coerced to put a catalytic converter onto the cars if they don't want to. We'll let the marketplace decide whether or not people want to breathe clean air, and if they don't, well, then the heck with it. I'm going to skip over, the next slide about saying I love you. This could be this is an interesting point of conversation. The idea of love, but I don't want to get too tangled up with it. And I'll go on to one more slide while I've got a bit more time. And actually, and this comes from another source where some authors connected some of Ayn Rand's work to business. And there's some interesting points here that I believe that these authors made. And if you think about it, first off, that for all of us, if I revert us back to a fairly simple survival-based, maybe an agrarian society or hunting and gathering society, if we don't work, we don't live, we don't survive. All of us have to work to survive, and what we produce is what differentiates us from others. If I produce more than you, then I'm going to have a more bountiful life. I'll eat better. I'll be healthier. I'll be warmer. If I'm a better builder, if I can build a better house, and then so be it. Maybe you can convince me to build a house for you, but you're going to have to make it in my interest to do so. Productive work is the central purpose of our life. That is kind of a key point or key implication number one. What we create belongs to us. We don't. We cannot actually. The third bullet point here reinforces this. Nothing that we create can be collectivized either by society or by the government or even by our employers. You can't compel me to produce anything, and if a government or a company or an organization begins to claim ownership of what individuals create, much like in John Galt's society, the individuals can go on strike, they can leave, they can go elsewhere. All production comes from individual initiative. And this leads us to a couple of other final points, and we'll conclude with these. Everyone is to be judged by what he or she creates. What you create is really your legacy. What you create is what others will respect. You may be a funny person, you may be a nice person, you may be that sort of thing. But what you create, I keep repeating myself on this one. What you create through your actions, through your reason, is how you will be judged. And finally, and this is an important one because, well, let's just get to it, right to it. Because she was so concerned, or so to her rationality and reason, and looking at things as objectively as possible was so critical, that faking anything, misrepresentation of anything, could not reliably be sustained. That is, if I'm a company and I keep manufacturing false profits, if I keep sending out fraudulent financial documents in order to attract investors and make me look wealthier, and then I go out and buy yachts and fancy planes and things like that. But the whole thing is kind of based on quicksand almost. There's nothing really underneath it. I've been lying. I've been misrepresenting. My products are not good. My financial statements are not good. My company is not healthy. I've been using accounting tricks or gimmicks. If I'm doing that, I'm denying reality. And ultimately, anyone who denies reality is, well, they're in for trouble. They can't sustain that over time. And so this is something that's also kind of important, is that while it seems self-centered and it seems selfish, and it seems this egoism or this subjectivism of Ayn Rand's seems harsh and cold, and it seems like survival of the fittest, and I'll do whatever I can to get ahead of you. And there may be, I can understand why people can see that. At the same time, it demands that everything be, if I can say, everything must be verified. Everything has to meet the standards of objective reality. If I lie, if I cheat, if I steal, then I'm not really successful, and I can't sustain that. All right, so thanks for bearing with us, and I'm going to get ready to post these, and hopefully this works. All right.